The South China Sea dispute is traceable to the 1951 San Francisco Treaty, which failed to allocate possession of the Spratly Islands when Japan lost its title to them after defeat in the Second World War. The dispute remains important, current, and highly charged. It was less than 2 weeks ago that Beijing created 2 administrative units on disputed islands, while most of the world's attention was focused on the pandemic. And yesterday morning, the US sailed a missile destroyer through the middle of territory that China claims. The South China Sea covers 3.5 million kilometers squared, and 1/3 of the world's trade and commerce passes through it. It's the key route for passage between the Indian and Pacific Oceans, and therefore having control of it gives you a lot of negotiating power. The South China Sea accounts for 10% of the world's fisheries, also making it a key source of food for hundreds of millions of people across the world. It's worth noting on the map here the locations of the Spratly Islands and the Paracel Islands, because these are 2 of the most highly disputed areas. A key reason for the dispute is that all involved parties want access to the wealth of natural resources that can be found under the seabed. In confirmed and probable reserves, there are 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas and 11 billion barrels of oil. Large areas still remain uninvestigated, and there is potential for vast quantities of resources to remain undiscovered. Access to these resources has huge economic benefits for all involved parties, and this is partly the reason why the islands that would give you access to these undiscovered resources is so heavily disputed. With the islands and the reefs comes the crux of the conflict. Who has sovereignty? Several countries are competing for sovereignty over a series of tiny islands, reefs, and shoals and their surrounding waters. Control of these islands gives access to the resources around them and allows nations to assert influence and control in the region. Many countries are developing islands they are occupying into military bases. China, in particular, is using dredging techniques to reclaim areas of land. So you can see on the right, Fiery Cross Reef, what it looked like before dredging, and China has reclaimed 677 acres of land and built a military outpost on it, which quite significantly houses an airstrip. Some Chinese officials, including the president of China, claim China's sovereignty over the area dates back to ancient times, while others date Chinese rule back to the Ming dynasty in the 15th century. However, all evidence suggests that the region was ungoverned until the 20th century, and instead was the home of semi-nomadic fisherfolk and pirates. The communist regime gained power in mainland China in October 1949, and along with it came a new narrative to justify expansion. The period of time between the Opium Wars and the communist victory in the Civil War is frequently referred to as the Century of Humiliation, and China now wants to reclaim its place as the Middle Kingdom at the center of the world. Between 1988 and 1995, China occupied 7 reefs in the Spratly Islands and began to transform the reefs into islands capable of supporting military facilities in 2013. In 2009, it issued a map with 9 dashes, shown here, showing its claim to sovereignty over more or less the whole sea. China has also repeatedly and often confronted rival claimants, especially Vietnam and the Philippines at sea, and broken international law doing so. Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan all claim to have sovereignty over at least some of the South China Sea. Vietnam claims sovereignty over the Paracel and Spratly Islands. The Philippines asserts ownership of the Spratly Archipelago and the Scarborough Shoal, and Brunei and Malaysia have claimed sovereignty over southern parts of the sea and some of the Spratly Islands. Most of their claims are based on physical proximity to the islands and waters, and international law falls on their side. The 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea created what is known as an economic exclusion zone. This gives a state special rights concerning exploration and use of marine resources in the area that stretches 200 nautical miles from a country's coast. The claims made by these countries are almost completely fall within their economic exclusion zones, and they are therefore supported by international law. In 2016, an international tribunal in The Hague ruled that China has no historical rights based on its 9-dash line map. Therefore, both China and Taiwan rejected this ruling. Why is the US involved? The US has wide-ranging security commitments in East Asia and is allied with several of the countries bordering the South China Sea, such as the Philippines, Singapore, and Vietnam. Furthermore, The South China Sea is a vital trade route in the global supply chain, used by American companies who produce goods in this region. The US has not officially backed any claimants, but openly criticizes China's actions, which it views as excessive. It regularly conducts what are known as freedom of navigation exercises, which involve it sailing destroyers within 12 miles of features claimed by China. How does the conflict impact specific relationships between countries? Trade in oceans are integral to countries becoming superpowers and achieving global supremacy. Many consider it not to be a coincidence that Beijing's South China Sea island building campaign began around the same time as China overtook the United States as the world's largest trading nation. The levels of tension and activity in the South China Sea are often used as a litmus test for the relationship between the two countries. While the Trump administration made a series of more hostile speeches at the beginning of the ongoing trade war, there was an increase in confrontation and challenges between the two nations in the region, with Chinese destroyers challenging US destroyers multiple times. The US thinks China's actions in the regions are excessive, while China criticizes the US for what it views as provocative behavior. Either way, it's a key point of clash that's worth keeping an eye on at the moment. Whether or not the dispute will ultimately improve relationships between the US and Vietnam is highly debated. The two countries have been cooperating in order to achieve their common goal of limiting Chinese influence in the region. As China's economic and military power outstrips that of the US by a decent amount, the United States is considering carefully how to contain China's power and influence before it overcomes other existing power structures. China's global political influence is powered by its economic wealth, which is growing. An alliance with Vietnam reverses the flow of new diplomatic wins by Beijing and would help deny Vietnam's exclusive economic zone to China for lucrative exploitation of oil, gas, and fish. It would serve as an example to other countries in the region on how to protect their economic exclusion zones and stand up to Chinese influence. This has the potential to be scaled to other countries in the region, which could see China becoming increasingly contained. Last month, the USS Theodore Roosevelt made the second ever visit by a US aircraft carrier strike group to Vietnam to mark 25 years of diplomatic relations and a growing security tie between the former Cold War antagonists. This shows close ties between the two countries. However, the US and Vietnam share few common values and ideologies and are currently only cooperating as a result of negative cohesion. Vietnam does not share the core belief in the key features of an free and open Indo-Pacific, which include freedom of navigation for warships. Vietnam has long had restrictions for warships on entering its territorial waters, not dissimilar to China's. In particular, Vietnam has both territorial sea baseline and prior notification regime that have been a direct target of US freedom of navigation operations with warships in the recent past. Many believe that this alliance will continue while it remains mutually beneficial, but it will not be long-lasting due to these differing beliefs. If you want to keep up with what's happening in the South China Sea at the moment, I would highly recommend this Asian Maritime Transparency Initiative. They have interactive maps and they have satellite scans of the different features in the area that are being developed by different countries, and you can track which islands are occupied by who, and they have a lot of information that's updated really regularly. And here's my bibliography, and thank you for listening.